The smell came first, burnt promethium and something sweeter, like roasted meat left too long over coals. I stood in the command bunker beneath Hive Secondary watching the picked feeds flicker and die one by one, and I knew we had made a terrible mistake. The greenskins were supposed to be stupid. Every tactical manual, every briefing scroll, every officer's lecture had told us the same thing. They were beasts, savages, incapable of learning. We had killed them by the thousand in the first assault. We had watched them throw themselves against our fixed defenses like waves against a breakwater, mindless and predictable. We had celebrated our superiority over wine requisitioned from the governor's private stores. I remembered the taste of it, acidic and too warm, coating my tongue as Major Kellis raised his glass and declared we had won. We had not won. I was a defense coordinator, mid-tier functionary, nothing special. 20 years in the Administratum's logistics division before the draft pulled me into military service when the greenskin fleet arrived. They gave me a uniform that didn't fit properly and an office 3 levels below the surface where the air tasted of recycled sweat and machine oil. My job was simple: monitor supply lines, coordinate ammunition shipments, ensure the gun emplacements never ran dry. I was not a soldier. I had fired a las rifle exactly twice in training and missed both times. But I could read charts and manage inventories, and that made me useful enough to keep alive. The first wave came on the 43rd day after planetfall. Intelligence, such as it was, reported a horde numbering perhaps 200,000 advancing across the ash wastes toward Hive Secondary with no apparent strategy. We had 80 kilometers of razor wire, 50 fixed artillery positions, 20 heavy weapon bunkers, and a regiment of infantry dug into trenches that stretched from the North Ridge to the Southern Causeway. The Fortress Doctrine called it impregnable. The Imperial Manual gave us a 94% probability of successful defense. They hit us at dawn. I watched from the picked screens as a green tide surged across the wasteland, howling creatures twice the size of a man, crude weapons waving overhead, vehicles cobbled together from scrap metal belching black smoke. Our artillery opened up at maximum range. The explosions were beautiful in a terrible way, perfect blooms of fire that swallowed dozens of the beasts at a time, leaving craters and charred meat. The greenskins kept coming. They ran into the razor wire and died by the hundred, tangled and bleeding. They charged the bunkers and were cut down by mastless fire. I counted 17 separate assaults over 6 hours. 17 times they came, 17 times we threw them back. By midday the attack had broken. The survivors retreated in disorder, leaving perhaps 30,000 corpses rotting in the sun. We lost 400 men. The Major called it a decisive victory. He ordered double rations that night and sent a message to Planetary Command recommending commendations. I stayed in my office tallying ammunition expenditure and listening to the Vox chatter from the front line. The soldiers were laughing. They called the greenskins stupid. They said it would be over within a week. I wanted to believe them. I wanted to believe the war would end cleanly, that I would survive long enough to return to my desk in the Administratum archives, that the smell of burnt flesh would eventually fade from my uniform. But there was something in the casualty reports that troubled me. The greenskins had not fled in panic. They had retreated in stages, some groups covering others, falling back in something that resembled order. It was subtle, easy to miss. I noted it in my daily log, but did not mention it in the briefing. Who would listen to a logistics clerk? The second wave came 12 days later. By then we had repaired the damaged sections of razor wire, replaced depleted ammunition stores, and rotated fresh troops into the forward positions. Morale was high. The men sang hymns to the Emperor while they cleaned their weapons. I filed supply requests and tried not to think about the bodies still lying in no man's land, bloating under the sun, too dangerous to recover. The greenskins attacked at night this time. That was the first difference. They came in darkness with no warning, no preliminary bombardment, just a sudden rush from 3 directions simultaneously. Our illumination flares went up and I saw them through the picked screens, thousands of green-skinned monsters, but they were moving differently now. They did not charge straight at the bunkers. They advanced in clusters, using the terrain, staying low, exploiting the dead ground between our firing positions. When our artillery zeroed in on one concentration, they scattered and reformed elsewhere. It took them 4 hours to reach the wire. This time they brought crude cutting tools, bolt cutters scavenged or manufactured from Emperor knows what. They cut gaps. They poured through. Our kill count was lower. The assault lasted until dawn and cost us 900 men before they withdrew. Major Kellis was less confident in the morning briefing. He blamed insufficient night vision equipment, inadequate reserves, poor Vox discipline. He did not mention that the enemy had adapted. I sat in the back of the room and watched him make excuses. My hands were shaking. I had not slept. I kept seeing the picked feed from Bunker 7 Theta, the moment when the greenskins had flanked it, using a dry riverbed none of our maps had marked. The defenders had died firing in the wrong direction. Their screams had come through the Vox clear and sharp, cutting through the static. Then silence. We reinforced the northern perimeter. We placed minefields in the dead ground. We requested additional troops from the Hive garrison and received a single understrength company. The quartermaster informed me we had expended 60% of our artillery shells. Resupply was scheduled for 30 days hence. I submitted a request for emergency allocation and was told to make do. I began rationing ammunition without informing the major. It seemed prudent. Someone had to think ahead. The third wave came 8 days later, mid-afternoon, under full sunlight. They struck the southern causeway with what looked like the same mindless aggression as the first assault. The defenders met them with concentrated fire and slaughtered them by the 100. It felt like the old days. The men were cheering, the major was smiling again. I watched the pick screens and felt cold despite the bunker's stifling heat. Because while the greenskins died in droves on the causeway, smaller groups had infiltrated from the east, using cover we did not know existed. Collapsed buildings, sewer tunnels, industrial ruins, and they were inside the outer perimeter before anyone noticed. The alarm went up too late. I heard it through the walls, a thin wailing siren that meant breach, that meant the enemy was among us. The Vox exploded with panicked voices. Bunker 14 was overrun. Bunker 12 was under close assault. The reserve company was moving to plug the gap, but they were too slow, too disorganized. I sat at my desk listening to men die while I stared at inventory reports. Someone was screaming that the greenskins had explosives, that they were demolishing the bunkers from inside, that they knew where the ammunition stores were hidden. That was when I understood. They were learning. Every assault taught them something new. They probed our defenses, tested our responses, identified our weaknesses, and returned with solutions. They were not stupid. They had never been stupid. We had mistaken savagery for ignorance, and now we were paying the price. The fighting lasted 3 hours. We sealed the breaches with mass infantry charges that cost another 2,000 men. The greenskins withdrew again, but this time they took equipment with them. A functioning Voxcaster, several lasguns, and a stack of tactical maps someone had left in an abandoned command post. Major Kellis had the officer responsible flogged and then shot. It did not matter. The damage was done. I stopped sleeping properly after that. I would lie on my cot in the cramped quarters behind my office, staring at the corroded pipes overhead, and count the ways we were going to die. The greenskins would learn to jam our Vox. They would learn to sabotage our water supply. They would learn the shift rotations and strike when the defenders were exhausted. Each possibility was more plausible than the last. I began to see patterns in the casualty reports, in the timing of the attacks, in the sectors they targeted. I drew charts and graphs that no one asked for. I wrote memoranda that no one read. I became obsessed with the idea that somewhere among the greenskin horde there was a mind, a terrible alien intelligence. studying us with the same cold attention I gave to my supply ledgers. The fourth assault came 6 days later. They used our own tactics against us. They bombarded our positions with captured artillery pieces they had somehow repaired and learned to operate. The shells were poorly aimed but numerous. Our counter-battery fire was hampered by ammunition shortages I could no longer hide. When their infantry advanced, they moved in coordinated groups with suppressing fire and flanking maneuvers that would not have shamed a guard regiment. They broke through in 2 places. We held the line only because Major Kellis ordered the demolition of an entire section of trench, burying 300 of our own men to create an impassable obstacle. I vomited in my office afterward. The smell would not leave me, not the chemical reek of the explosives, but something else, something I could not name, an odor that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. It was the smell of decay, of systems failing, of an edifice crumbling from within. I filed my reports with trembling hands. I noted that ammunition reserves were at 28%. I requested immediate resupply. I was informed that the supply convoy had been ambushed 40 kilometers east. No survivors, no cargo recovered. The Greenskins, it seemed, had learned to read our logistical routes. Major Kellis stopped holding briefings. He stayed in his private quarters with a bottle of Amasec and a loaded bolt pistol on his desk. Command devolved to Captain Vross, a hard-faced woman who had lost her entire family in the first landing. She was competent. She was ruthless. She understood what I understood, that we were going to lose, but she was too proud or too faithful to admit it aloud. She ordered the construction of fallback positions, interior barricades, a final redoubt around the command bunker. She told the men we were fortifying for a long siege. She did not tell them we were preparing a tomb. The 5th assault was different. They attacked everywhere at once, a massive coordinated offensive that hit every sector simultaneously. They used smoke to blind our gunners. They used explosives to breach the wire. They used captured Vox frequencies to issue false orders that sent entire squads running to the wrong positions. I watched it unfold on the pic screens and felt something break inside me. This was not savagery. This was war fought with doctrine and discipline. They had learned everything. They had become us, but stronger, more numerous, and utterly without fear. We lost the outer perimeter in 4 hours. We lost the northern bunkers by nightfall. Captain Vross pulled everyone back to the interior line and set fire to the supply depots to deny them to the enemy. The smoke was so thick I could taste it in the recycled air 3 levels down. It tasted like failure. It tasted like ash and ruined faith. I stayed at my post because there was nowhere else to go. I compiled casualty lists that no one would ever read. I calculated our remaining ammunition, enough for perhaps 2 hours of sustained combat. I wrote a final report and sealed it in a message canister, though I had no idea who would receive it. The Voxnet was collapsing. Half the channels were dead. The rest were chaos. Overlapping voices screaming contradictory orders, begging for extraction, praying for deliverance that would not come. The Greenskins reached the secondary perimeter at dawn. I heard them through the walls, heavy footfalls, guttural laughter, the clang of metal on metal. They were not rushing, they were methodical. They knew we were finished. They could afford to be patient. Captain Vross issued the order to retreat to the final redoubt. I gathered my reports and my charts and followed the stream of bleeding, exhausted soldiers down the narrow corridors into the bunker's deepest level. We sealed the blast doors. We counted heads. 400 men left from a garrison of 12,000. Someone was sobbing. Someone else was praying, the words tumbling out too fast to understand. We waited. The ventilation system was failing. The air grew hot and stale. The smell of bodies pressed together, of fierce sweat and blood and infected wounds was overwhelming. I sat with my back against the wall and clutched my data slate, staring at numbers that no longer mattered. Captain Vross tried to organize a final defense, placing men at each access corridor with the last of the ammunition. It was futile. We all knew it, but routine is a comfort when everything else has collapsed. The greenskins did not storm the redoubt. They did not need to. They sealed the exits from the outside and then they waited. Hours passed. The air grew fouler. Men began to suffocate, slow and agonizing. Someone tried to force the doors open. The explosion of a grenade rigged as a trap killed 6 people. After that, we simply sat in the darkness and waited to die. I do not know how long we lasted. Time lost meaning. The pick screens went dark. The emergency lights failed. We were in absolute blackness, breathing each other's spent air, listening to the rasp of failing lungs. I thought about the very first report I had filed, the one that noted the greenskins' orderly retreat. I thought about how no one had listened. I thought about the millions of worlds across the Imperium, all of them defended by men who believed the enemy was too stupid to learn, too savage to plan, too primitive to adapt. How many of those worlds had already fallen? How many were falling right now? Someone near me started laughing, a high, cracked sound that went on until it faded into breathless whimpering. I realized it was Captain Vross. She was talking, a rambling monologue about her children, about the garden they had kept in the mid-hive, about flowers I had never heard of. Her voice grew softer. Then it stopped. I was still holding my data slate when the air finally ran out. My fingers were cramped around it, locked tight. I thought about the reports I had written, the warnings I had tried to give, the pattern I had seen and failed to communicate. I thought about the next hive, the next world, the next defense coordinator who would sit in a bunker and watch the pick screens and believe the same lies we had believed. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell them. But there was no air left and no one to hear. The darkness swallowed everything. I felt my heartbeat slowing, each pulse heavier than the last. I thought I heard the blast doors opening, the hiss of fresh air flooding in, but it was too late for me. Too late for all of us. The greenskins had learned patience. They had learned to wait. They had learned that sometimes the best way to kill an enemy is to let him kill himself. My last thought was about the smell, the burnt promethium and roasted meat that had filled my nostrils on that first day when I watched them die by the thousand and thought we had won. It was the same smell now, but I understood it differently. It was not the smell of their defeat. It was the smell of their education. Every corpse had been a lesson. Every failed assault had been a test. And we had taught them everything they needed to know. The Imperium builds its walls high and its faith higher, but neither can hold against an enemy who learns. I tried to write that in my final report, but the words would not come. My hands would not move. There was only the smell and the darkness and the weight of inevitability pressing down like the mass of 1,000 failed worlds. They say the greenskins are beasts. They say it in every manual and every briefing and every prayer. They say it because to admit otherwise would be to admit that we are not fighting monsters but mirrors, creatures who can learn and adapt and overcome just as we do, but without the weight of doctrine and tradition and bureaucratic inertia that slows our every response. To admit that would be to admit that the Imperium's greatest advantage, its vast institutional memory, is also its greatest weakness, because we remember only our victories and never our mistakes. I tried to tell them, I tried to make them understand. But in the end, I was just a logistics clerk with shaking hands and a data slate full of numbers no one would ever read. And now I am nothing at all, just another name on a casualty list that will be filed and forgotten, another soul added to the tally of a war that never ends and never learns and never changes. The greenskins learned. We did not. That is the only truth that matters. When they opened the bunker, hours later, days later, I do not know, they found us exactly as we died, suffocated, entombed. The enemy had not even bothered to breach the final door. Why waste lives on something that would solve itself? I imagine them standing over our bodies, those hulking green-skinned killers examining our equipment, our maps, our fortifications. learning, always learning. And then moving on to the next hive, the next city, the next world, carrying with them everything we taught them. Somewhere in the Imperium, a defense coordinator is sitting at a desk, reading a tactical manual that says the greenskins are stupid. He is planning his defenses. He is confident. He is already dead and does not know it yet. I wish I could tell him. I wish I could warn him. But the dead have no voice, and the Imperium has no ears. The smell is all that remains, burnt promethium and roasted meat, and the sweet, sick odor of decay. It fills the bunker, it fills the world, it fills the galaxy. And still we build our walls, and trust our doctrine and refuse to learn, because learning would mean admitting we were wrong, and the Imperium cannot afford to be wrong. It can only afford to die, again and again and again, in darkness and silence, and the suffocating certainty that we brought this upon ourselves. I am gone now. My name will be recorded in a ledger somewhere, misspelled, misfiled, eventually lost. The bunker will be reclaimed or abandoned. The war will continue. And somewhere, on some distant world I will never see, another clerk will sit at another desk and watch the enemy die by the thousand, and believe it means victory. He will be wrong. He will die learning how wrong. And no one will listen to his warnings either. This is the truth they do not teach in the tactical manuals. The greenskins are not stupid. They are students. And we are their tuition, paid in blood and failure and the slow, horrible realization that comes too late to matter. They learn from us. They become what we are. And they do it better, because they are not burdened by the weight of 10,000 years of institutional blindness. I died in the dark, clutching my data slate, surrounded by the corpses of men who believed what they were told. I died knowing that everything I had tried to say would be ignored, that the pattern I had seen would remain unseen, that the lesson we could have learned would go unlearned. I died as we all die in the Imperium, uselessly, pointlessly, our sacrifice meaning nothing, because the machine that consumes us is incapable of change. The smell lingers. Even now, wherever I am, whatever I have become, I can still smell it. Burnt promethium, roasted meat. And underneath it all, faint but unmistakable, the smell of fear. Our fear, the greenskins' triumph, the Imperium's slow, inevitable collapse into a darkness that we ourselves created by refusing to see what was always in front of us. They learned. We did not. And that is why they won.